This webinar is Driving Retention and Employee Performance. We're excited to have our presenter today. Before we get started, we have just a few items we'd like to cover with you on ATD. So, Ken? All right, great. We're going to talk about Power Membership, and just a reminder that Power Membership offers members twice the support, gives us twice the resources and twice the networking than just one membership. ATD gives us the tools that we need to succeed, and chapter membership applies those tools to your organization and community. So we want you to consider becoming a Power member if you're not already. Some of our upcoming events, we have Talent Development in Dynamic Times, September 24th, which is next week, at the Houston Food Bank. So if you haven't signed up, please sign up for that. We have CTNs around the city. We have the Woodland CTN, the Downtown CTN, the Galleria CTN, and the Southeast CTN. So please consider those at lunchtime as well. All right. Some other events. General meeting, we have the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team will be October 13th from 5:30 to 8 at the United Way of Greater Houston, and our speaker will be Alan Duncan. So don't forget to mark your calendars and attend that event. Then for our general meeting, the topic will be facilitating for today's mobile enhanced audiences. That should be pretty exciting. That's going to be November the 10th from 5:30 to 8, again at the United Way, and Larry Straining will be the speaker. Our next webinar will be October 22nd, How to Grow Your Revenues by 10% or More. And if your mission is to develop others, what do you do for yourself and your business? So please attend this webinar, which is for training and development professionals who have their own practice. Or if you're thinking about getting your own practice and you just want to increase your client success before you even start out. So think about coming to this webinar and please sign up. We have our new members online orientation on October the 8th. So come and learn everything about ATD Houston chapter, what we have to offer, and you can see here what those opportunities are. Today's speaker is Mr. Duncan Welder IV. He is with RISC, and he is the Director of Client Services, and we're excited to have him with us today, and so we're going to turn it over to him. Duncan?
Yes, ma'am. I appreciate it. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen out. I appreciate you guys having me in and everybody joining here at lunchtime, at least in the U.S. Central Time Zone. Happy afternoon for those of you to our east, and good morning to those of you out west. As mentioned, my name is Duncan Welder. I work for RISC. We're a LMS provider here in Houston, and thrilled to have the opportunity to get together and chat today. And in one of those capacities where I don't chat at all about learning management systems, which is my normal day in, day out bread and butter, but really getting to talk about learning retention. What are some of the tools and techniques that we can use to help increase retention? And overall, our ultimate goal is certainly employee performance. How do we help people perform better on the job there? So we'll explore through a number of tools and techniques. We'll also chat through a couple small case studies there towards the end of the session. So before we even slide into objectives there, let me play a real quick clip. Hey.
Armies of academics going forward measuring poetry. No! You'll not have that here. No more, Mr. James. Now, my class, you will learn to think for yourselves again. You will learn to savor words and language. No matter what anybody tells you, words and ideas can change the world.
All right, so a little shot from the, from Dead Poets Society there with Robin Williams energizing the crowd, saying we're not going to think about things as words as these dead items, in poetry very specifically in this case as these dead items, but really trying to energize that crowd, build some emotional tie with them, and get them thinking about analysis and truly incorporating the ideas of this subject matter, poetry, often considered a fairly dry topic there, inside the classroom. So we're going to do some of the same today and look at these same tools. So as we go through this next 45 minutes or hour, we're going to talk about some of the common challenges for traditional instructor-led training as well as online training. We're going to talk through some of the techniques used to drive retention. Some of these we'll talk about in a conceptual sense, some of them in a very concrete way, and how we can incorporate some of those small techniques, including things like having that bit of video at the beginning of our discussion to help draw in a little bit of interest and again, emotional tie there. We'll look for opportunities to link independent learning systems for additional benefit. And here what I'm talking about is thinking about training not as individual events, not as specific systems. Here's online testing systems maybe, or audience response systems and learning management systems and content, but really what's that overall learning ecosystem, and how do we make the sum of that entire ecosystem greater than the sum of its individual parts. Start looking for ways of linking those different elements there. The other couple things we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about some moves to very competency-based personal development plan training strategies. A little bit different, but something that I've seen emerging more and more recently, especially in very technical audiences, and that'll be the basis of our second case study there. And finally, outlining some data points that we can use now today, things that exist in many of our current learning environments that we can start to leverage to really look at building a continuous improvement process for training. So again, excited about stepping through this morning. So with that, what are some of those big challenges to traditional instructor-led training? And one of the things that I get feedback on regularly, we do a lot of evaluation, is problems people have with training. It's much more difficult for us to get good feedback on what are those key valuable elements there. But some of the things that I regularly hear, and I hope some of these resonate with you, I'd love for you to, if you'd like to drop into the question area that Ken is monitoring there, any additional items or things, I'm glad to take those and chat through those as well. But a number of the things that I see day in, day out, challenges to a traditional instructor-led training. That low knowledge check or low interactivity issue, right? So many times that traditional lecture format, I'm, as a presenter, delivering information, and then recipients are having that information wash over them with some expectation that there's value or some takeaway there, which may not be the case. There's often in the classroom environment limited opportunity for hands-on experience. How do I actually do something and move it through? The pace tends to be pretty tightly managed, so you have, think about the spectrum of learners there. You're going to have folks that are already moving forward mentally as you make a statement and are ready for the next item. There are other people that are still processing, have a little lag time there, and how do you manage getting those through at the same rate without losing people on either end of that spectrum? Clearly, with traditional instructor-led training, there's the challenge of time and scheduling and getting people together. There's also a lack of post-event follow-up. So many times we think of training, especially in a very corporate environment, as a one-time event. So I attend training and then I am done. I move on to the next thing. One of the things that I always try to go back to, and I started using this set of, or this graphic, a number of years ago. I got it from Corporate University Enterprises, and what they were looking at is the effectiveness of training and where to spend time. And what they found is 50% of effectiveness happens in the follow-up after training, checking in. Are you using the tools that are that were covered? Have you run into any roadblocks that prevent you from executing what was taught in class? But then also, what happens on the front side of training? What's my pre-work? When I walk in the room, am I prepared and ready to really start analyzing and synthesizing the information that comes in? So the problem that we run into here, as you can tell from this graphic, is that we spend almost all of our time focused on that learning event, very little on the pre-work side, and very, very little on the post-work side. So something to think about as we go through. And a number of these techniques that we'll talk about for helping improve retention in the classroom stem from this very bit of research. Pre-work really helps set that foundation. I use my learning event for the higher level skills, the analysis, the application, and then I make sure I maintain some touch following training so that it actually gets used and moved into practice, becomes a habit, becomes information. So a number of things that are issues with traditional instructor-led training. A bit of a different slate of challenges for e-learning that I get feedback on regularly. The first one is, gosh, I need some kind of interactivity with a subject matter expert, and I don't get that when I'm sitting watching or clicking through a e-learning module on, say, bloodborne pathogens awareness, as opposed to having a subject matter expert delivering that training where we can get into a sideline discussion. One of the other things that I hear very often is to get a very check-the-box perception, which ties into that next bullet item, the lower perceived value compared to instructor-led training. One of the things that you'll find, or one of the things that I think we're guilty of on the training side of the world, is pushing a lot of those low-level items over to e-learning. Certainly a good place for those, gives me some foundation information like we talked about earlier, but when there is a inundation of that online content being pushed towards us, you get to have this backlash of, oh gosh, I just have to crank through these online modules so that I can move on to whatever my real work is. So that lower perceived value is something I think we have to climb uphill to try to find. And a lot of that gets back to what we can do from a design or a layout of training interventions, not looking at it as a instructor-led course or an e-learning module, but really the entire end-to-end package for training. So what are some of those things that we can do? I think the first thing we have to think about is, what do our users need, our learners need? I should have made a quick poll there to find out how many folks in attendance are from the academic side of the world, the K through 12 or the K through 12 or secondary education versus the corporate environment. But working with the corporate environment.
And if you, I'm sorry to jump in here,
sure,
Duncan, but if you put in the question box, you can answer that really quickly. So you can do polls that way, and I can kind of communicate the information back. I also wanted to mention, I know I heard from John, and he was having trouble seeing the presentation. I see it, and I haven't heard from anybody else. So if you're also having trouble, just drop something in the question box, and we'll see if we can clear that up. But I see the presentation on my end. So.
All right, fantastic. I appreciate that. So I say since our primary focus is on adult learners, especially in the corporate environment, we had to be sensitive to how we learn as adults and the things that drive us and how those are different, especially from younger people, children that are much more open to receiving training because, gosh, I tell you that we need some kind of training, or you have to get out of bed and go to school. One of those is the allowance to be self-directed. You and I will go out and find information when we have a need for it. It's something that we do. So if there's the opportunity in a class to allow people to have more self-directed drive for searching out answers, working in small groups, things that help engage the learner, that engagement builds a positive experience, or sometimes a negative experience, but that experience provides context to attach that information to some kind of training there, which again leads us to the need for context. We're not a blank slate. We are coming into any kind of learning experience, any experience at all, with the context of our own experience. So we process thousands of little experiences every day. We sort them through. We accept things that fit into our context. We reject things that don't fit into our context. Say an example here a while back that I had, totally not training related, but I was on a divided highway driving, had 2 lanes going eastbound, and could not believe when I look up and see everyone's getting into the right-hand lane because there's a car coming our direction on the, coming westbound on those eastbound lanes. But it took a minute for it to work through the context of my mind because I know that this is an area where we're all moving in the same direction, and to be able to break that context can be very, very difficult. So what does this render for us? One, as we're presenting new information, there's that question of why. Why is this important to me? What is the context? How does it fit? And if I can leverage someone's experience and draw that out so that they can take new information and tether it to that existing experience, I help build an additional network of connections there inside my brain to help increase retention on that new content. It's got some relevancy. It holds on to a spot there versus being that random fact that that just exists without any reference to it. This is, if you've shared my experience of teaching children multiplication tables and trying to get the concept of 3 times 3 across and say, why is this 9? And if you can put those in blocks and help understand, provide that context, even in that very rudimentary way, it improves retention. It helps provide that clarity. So something that we often are negligent of in trying to get information out, often because of time and the requirement of getting things done in the most expedient way possible, we forget that there's a question, especially with adults, that say, all right, why is this important to me? And I need to tie that back to experience and context. The final item here is a drive for problem and solution orientation. So as an adult, I am trying to figure out how to make my next step. Whatever is my next challenge, how do you solve that? So from a training perspective, if we can incorporate that drive for problem solving, or that orientation for problem solving, and pull that out in a classroom environment, in a field training environment, in an e-learning module, in some kind of flipped classroom environment, that helps engage that student. Again, you build that tie back to what's in it for me, that value, and increase retention there. So these things are all based on really the way that our brain works. And I think it's always important to remember that we need to focus on making sure that we are sensitive to how the brain really manages information when we're giving training. So a lot of this is having short breaks and rehearsal time and things to help encode information as it's moving from my short to long-term memory, right? Because as I initially hear something, I've got some kind of stimulus coming in, or I read it, or I watch a YouTube video, or whatever the case is there, it initially hits my mind, but I can just filter that out. I might have too much interference going on in the background. Other things are happening, it just doesn't stick, it doesn't resonate. So I have to get from stimulus coming in to some kind of focus on it. I give it some attention, and then I start rolling it through my working memory, but that's the place where work has to happen, because I have to encode that and make it attached to other things inside my brain, other experiences, other information, so that I can retrieve that later. Was reading something just the other day that, from a cognitive science standpoint, that there are some people that argue there's really not a lot of memory loss, right? It's just the fact that we don't get the right cues to help pull those memories back out. So I say not certainly an expert in the science behind, but an interesting thing to think about, even if I recognize there's some long-term memory decay, and I guess I recognize it more and more as I get older. But even in that case, having the right cues to pull memories back, to pull information back, is critical. And the reason that can occur is because we need to build a neural network that ties these different experiences and learning together. And very often, I mentioned the term a couple times, tying in some kind of emotion. So thinking about that short video at the beginning of the presentation, there's something to make you shift gears a little bit, separate out other distractors. Suddenly I have a bit of focus. Maybe you think, gosh, this is a clip that I've seen before, it's a clip that I've not seen, it's a person that I like. It's like, look at the people in the crowd. It builds some tether, some emotion there. And one of, or the very first of Gagne's 9 events for learning is really acquiring attention and building some emotion there. The other thing I wanted to talk about, or again, more in a very conceptual way, because I don't necessarily, don't necessarily understand the full science and research behind and the nuance there. I'm not qualified to speak of it at that way, but wanted to introduce the idea of the 70-20-10 theory or framework. And the idea there behind is that essentially 70% of learning comes through experience, 20% is learned from others, and only 10% from structured courses and programs. And again, the science behind and so from an academic standpoint, I am not at all qualified to argue the merits here or the nuance. But in a conceptual sense, if we can start looking at bringing experience into the classroom in some way and also working with others, then it helps even this field out a little bit. So when we talk about learning through experience, with things that are on the job, new information, solving problems, having a project that I might need to complete, it could be purely exploratory as well, right? If I have a new tool, a new vehicle, all those things that happen, you spend a little time exploring right up front, and then you tend to hold that information because I am exploring my way through and learning that information, as opposed to things like learning from others, coaching, mentoring, where we work together but then go back separately and try to apply skills there. So again, just a little bit of a shift there. And then the final item, things like classes, seminars, workshops, webinars like this one. And I struggle with this format very often because it is a very one-way application, and try to use things like polling questions and getting feedback in to help create some additional engagement there. But say one of those that can be an issue. So without arguing the science behind, if this is true, what can we do to help simulate experience in the classroom and help people build learning opportunities that will resonate more deeply than that wash of information and moving back out from that one-time training opportunity. So there are a few things, and there are a few things that I'll list out here. There are a number of items, and when we chat after the presentation, I'd love to hear other thoughts and experience there, if that's something you could roll around in your mind. But what are some of those things that can help support adult learning? There's some hot topic things that are relatively new and flashy that people have focus on more recently, like digital storytelling, visual collaboration. The flipped classroom idea has been very popular inside the traditional K through 12 and collegiate levels of managing a class. And here what I'm really talking about is generally providing the bulk of content outside of a class and really dedicating class time to application. So many times peer-to-peer teaching and having an instructor that's there for support and guidance, but not as the primary delivery mechanism. Now this is hard, I'm going to tell you right up front, because you have to give up a lot of control, which as an instructor can be difficult there. I experienced one of those very uncomfortable workshops earlier this year. I was sitting in as an audience member and using this same technique, but using audience response devices, and it's one of the things we'll take a look at earlier. And they were asking basic, physics questions in this classroom. Very specifically, if you have a metal plate that gets heated up, the entire thing expands. If you have a metal plate with a hole in the middle, does the hole get bigger or smaller when it gets heated up? And it was about 30% of the class that got it right initially. They broke people up into small groups, they had to discuss it, and then each table got to vote or got to answer, and the correct percentage actually fell from 30% down lower. If you're curious, the hole gets larger when the plate heats, but it takes confidence in what you're delivering and the ability to explain there to get those things back on track. So this is an application that certainly works in an adult situation. Does take some instructor faith in their abilities there. Digital storytelling, I always like to think about the film Lucy there with Morgan Freeman when he's giving a lecture, and I always has in the background playing a series of video montage that will discuss evolution or whatever the case is there. And we all now really have that ability, most of us in our shirt pocket or purse at this point, to create some kind of snippet of information that is visual, graphical, auditory, some way of pulling information in. And the nice thing about using, especially that digital storytelling or elements of multimedia in presentations, even things that are very short, is it helps, again, stimulate emotional ties. It makes you think about what's happening because you're generally selecting an event that's not necessarily or a topic of a video that's not directly tied, but requires some analysis to say, all right, how is this relevant to my topic now? It helps reinforce ideas, plus, helps tap into multiple learning styles here. And this is not something that is, magic or difficult. I remember distinctly one professor when I was in school that would do this every class period or every few class periods, but at that time with cassette tapes or with VHS cassettes to play some kind of snippet just to get us kicked off and start our minds working in the direction of whatever our topic was that day. Visual collaboration, again, ties in less with the interactions sitting there in the classroom together, but much more building relationships, because as we talked about creating that neural network and tying experience back to, or tying new information back to existing experience, the same can be used in a collaborative way in a distributed audience by fostering the relationship between people, which helps gel those learning experiences, then fostering conversation there. Gives me, again, some kind of thing to see or to feel, and if you notice how many people will set avatars or profile pictures or those things to really drive their individuality, right? I see someone who's a kayaker will have a kayaking picture even in a very professional setting, because it defines a bit of who they are, and creating that internal relationship between learners can be very, very valuable. I said there are a ton of these techniques out there. Case studies, certainly an easy application to move into a classroom format or an online training format. And again, the key, the meat behind the science of case studies is that it has some relevancy to me. There are some that are more fitting for different discussions, things like fish bowls, right, where you'd have an inner circle and an outer circle, and the inner circle is given a problem to resolve. The outer circle is there to make notes on the discussion of that inner circle and then debrief after and switching places there. So a very, very human-oriented operation. I know that there's a series of groans happening across the world as I talk about role play, but again, if you have the opportunity for role play or simulation of some kind, if that's a better, you say less emotionally charged term than role play, certainly a great thing to do. And then finally, things like mind mapping, structured note taking that will let me incorporate multiple learning styles, something visual, laid out, maybe invoking different people or roles inside those activities as a group, and again, fostering more synthesis and creativity through those applications. So again, some different techniques there. What I was going to do is shift gears just a bit and talk about two very brief case studies here, where really unbeknownst, I think in some ways, folks have stumbled into these success stories because a lot of these elements have been used in their training presentations or their learning interventions. So the first, a bit of an interesting animal. It's a highly regulated industry, working that we're working with here. This one of our area being Houston-based. Now this team, pardon me, had received a lot of backlash from web-based training, and it was primarily due to that inundation, because we've moved to the point of making everything very easy to push to an online format, not necessarily good online format. A number of companies have moved that direction and just flooded people with web-based training. And this is one of those cases where they felt like, gosh, all you're trying to get me to do is to check the box from a regulatory standpoint. They didn't have a lot of faith in their web-based training. The problem is this is a very distributed workforce, and they had some criticisms of instructor-led training as well, right? The only reason that I'm here is to sit and find out what is being catered and then fill out my smile sheet at the end of the day. So had some negative issues there around instructor-led training, and the other big problem that they have with the instructor-led training is how do they follow up and document, and needing to have tests done. And if someone does not pass a test, how do they get that person back through the content to remediate and to retest until they met whatever satisfactory level is required there. So again, one of those that was a difficult challenge, and what they did is really followed much more of that flipped classroom kind of focus, so they could deliver pre-work before someone got to class. When they're in class, and what they were using is a audience response system, turning technologies in that very specific case, but there are online polling and phone-based tools that you can use for the same thing there. But what it allowed them to do was let the instructor move off of the stage and pose questions as they're working through, get feedback, again, displayed on the screen if you've worked with these technologies before, and give immediate feedback for correction, making sure people are on track. Also, I say, like that example earlier with the physics problem, shape learning as it goes through. They also had some additional benefits, and this is that one of the other bullet items that I mentioned on the agenda there is tying these pieces of information together. So they had this audience response capability in existence. Right? It was already there and something that they used, but they used it in a very flat, unidirectional way. The kind of the classic Jeopardy model, where someone asks a question, there's a poll, all right, the top answer is 25%, but they weren't using it for really leveraging that technology the way that they could. So what they did in this case is they were able to synchronize all this data with their learning management system. So in that same audience response activity, they were able to not only deliver tests, they were able to have students register that they were in the class or are acknowledged, so they were using it for attendance. They used it for their post-class evaluations, and because the data is all being written back, their documentation needs are met. The other benefits that the group saw: radical increase in retention following 30 days doing post-class testing. Now, I'll tell you right now, post-class testing is one of those follow-up items from that earlier graphic, right? So this is something that will help drive retention anyway. But they saw the climb there. They also saw a huge amount of improvement in the learner's receptiveness to training. They weren't sitting there having that information being washed over them. They had the opportunity to participate, and they were driven to be part of the right answer, which I thought was a very interesting way of stating that that information. So I mentioned they had their natural vehicle for reporting, also a very natural vehicle for retakes, because in this case, what they were able to do, because they tied the audience response system again into their learning management system, is if someone did not pass a test in the class. It's not like they had to stay over. They didn't have to take the test again immediately. Everyone leaves at the same time. But when that person gets back to their desk, the same system that would have triggered them for retaking a test that they'd failed if they, say, had gone through an online course is there and in place. So again, making a creative link between disparate systems to help support and improve that overall learning ecosystem there. So just a couple of the other things, I mean, absolutely gave them full item analysis, of course, on their question bank, so they could go through and then help improve their training materials or their testing to identify any issues that were in the item analysis, again, because they were forward-thinking enough to tie those elements in together and incorporate them into more of that flipped classroom design. The second case study piece, and one that I've found is interesting as well, is really a second phase, and I'll give you a bit of background there. This is a group that is in the power generation business. So they have a regulatory requirement to assess all of their operators, and to do that, built competency profiles, had supervisors and qualified evaluators go out and sign people off. They documented this whole process, which is great. That's a lot of things that people are doing now, right? So moving to that more competency-based, competency-focused assessment. What was different is how they could use that data and how they moved into their second year after the initial rollout of this competency management program and assessing people initially. First, they were able to look at work output, things that were done, any kind of negative performance trends following training. They could continue to do things like analysis of their question bank. They looked at student feedback, assessor feedback, and what they decided to do going forward wasn't to create a training plan and assign it to a group of operators. What they did is they focused back on those individual competencies, and out of those provided a menu of developmental opportunities to help maintain or improve competence in these different areas. So exceeding government requirements and really focusing on the individual, they'd essentially cancel someone's last qualification, or if you think of it as erasing the last assessment. Now it's still recorded for me, and clearly if I'm going to audit, it shows that I have completed this assessment, or my supervisor completed this assessment on me at some point in the very recent past, and I'm still within legal compliance. But by picking out the key things driven by performance trends and disabling, if you will, that last assessment, it forced students to go in and on their own pick the right interventions to help them requalify. So they essentially would allow training to mark someone again as competent after they had been disqualified there. So a very, very personalized approach. And I know this is something that I personally find, having spent now 20 years in learning management systems, very scary, right? Because I think here's a very prescriptive training plan, and that's one thing, and it gets pushed out to people, and then there are developmental opportunities that are more a la carte or open enrollment that I can seek out. But in this case, a bit of a blend, and again, giving more of the control back to students so they can pick the intervention that's best for them, something that is a good fit on their side. actually at the ATD International Conference back in May of this year, right? May June timeframe. Listened to a fascinating presentation by a gentleman from Qualcomm, and his statement was that they've really moved away from tracking any training that's not an absolute compliance item, but developing and spending almost all their time developing new content or new opportunities there. And a lot of what they're doing is mobile training, because they build chips for mobile phones. It's one of the big challenges that they have is they've got this huge wall of tablets that goes over all the patents that they have, because they have people that are looking now with a 5 or 6 year development cycle for new chips to go into smartphones. They're having to predict today where I need, say, more bandwidth. Are we going to be using more video? Are we going to be using more audio? Do we need to put more processor time into things like geolocation and GPS? So they are inundating their learners with content in different formats, in different ways, but not requiring it. They're tracking its use after the fact, and things that don't get used, they eliminate. Things that do get used, they build more of. So something to think about, again, there, not that I'd say to abandon any kind of prescriptive training, but something to consider is what other data points are available that can help me drive my improvement to my training processes. One of the things the ASTD put out prior to the name change was this big data, a quick start guide for learning practitioners. So they said nearly a third of global organizations with more than 1,000 employees are already leveraging big data, specifically learning related big data there. This is one of those cases where for the first time we have the capability technically to easily go in and analyze these large banks of information. So if you're in a petrochemical refining environment, I can take data from a distributed control system and tie that back to a person's performance and driving his or her training plan. You can do the same thing in a number of different industries with data that's already being captured there. The key, the trick, the challenge is identifying where all these things can come from and how to tether them together and how to make decisions based on that information. So again, the things that I look at as the key challenges, the takeaways there. Once we've looked at creating training that's better focused on adult learning and incorporating those techniques, what are the other tools that we have in our toolbox? They may be training related tools, things like an online system for surveys and evaluations, or a competency management system, things that you'd think of in the realm of traditional training, learning, and development. But it may also be things that are very much outside. It could be standard business measures. What's our fuel gas firing rate at this point? What is the wear on brake pads between different operators in a driving scenario? So there's a ton of the stuff that we hadn't ever really tracked before. If we've tracked them very independently, and I think it's a challenge to move back out of our day in, day out operation and say, gosh, I have this information, I have these tools, how do I start tying them together? Some of that's going to come from soliciting pain points from your users. What is valuable, what is not? One of the other things, especially from a practitioner side, that I think does not happen often enough, is to introduce different partners, whether those are technology partners or they're content development partners. So often we keep these different systems in silos and we never connect them, and it's an easy relationship then when, say, that audience response device partner is introduced to that learning management system partner to say, hey, there are some pieces here that we don't understand, but they really should fit together, and what's the best way for us to do that? And then finally, remember that training is always a continuously evolving process, so we have to focus on evaluation and shaping things. And we have, with, again, the ATD's promotion of things like the successful, easy for me to say, successive approximation model, the SAM model, over the traditional ATD kind of model there. Not that I think there's a hard endorsement one way or another, but the idea of looking at rapid prototyping, issuing things out, revising. The gentleman from Qualcomm that gave the presentation at the ATD International show said that they keep, if I'm not mistaken, basically 2 out of every 5 training elements that they create. They create twice as much, more, content than they actually ever really need, but it's easier to push it out and then monitor the use and determine what needs to be enhanced, what needs to be retired all the way through, because the final thing is you just can't forget the learners in this whole piece, and you have to tie their needs back in and look at training interventions from their perspective if you're going to help drive retention and you're going to help promote employee performance and tie that back to your training initiatives. So with that, I recognize that I am reaching the top of the hour there. My general contact information, if there's anything that I can ever do, and of course this is all on the ATD website as well. With that, I'll kick it back over to you, Ken. I don't know if there are questions or things that came up that we want to chat through there.
I haven't noted anything come through, but if people want to add anything right now, any questions, any feedback, and while you're doing that, Janeth, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
We appreciate you sharing with us today while we wait to see if anybody has any questions, and thank you for giving us an exciting webinar today.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. I appreciate you guys having me.
All right, not seeing anything come through in the question area. Again, I echo Janeth. Thank you, Duncan, for sharing with us today and presenting to the ATD Houston group.
Have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Will do. Thank you.